Okay, let's pick up a new topic. At the heart of social cognition is social perception. What we're always trying to do when we encounter somebody or move into a social situation or engage in some kind of social behavior is to form an impression of what's going on, and that's what social perception really is all about. One thing we know about perception in general is that perception and categorization are uniquely, intimately associated with each other. Jerome Bruner pointed out at one point that every act of perception entails an act of categorization, because in the very process of perceiving something and identifying something, we identify something as similar to some things we already know about and different from other things that we already know about. So inferring the categorical, or categorical, that's the way I'd put it, that's his word, identity of an object is as much a feature of perception as anything else. Now, just as a little historical note here, Bruner was an early cognitive psychologist. He was way ahead of the game in that respect. And before Bruner, it was customary in psychology, there wasn't cognitive science yet, it was customary in psychology to make a distinction between so-called lower and higher mental processes. Lower mental processes were those that were very closely tied to the stimulus situation, like sensation and perception. Higher mental processes were those that somehow got away from the immediate stimulus, like memory and thinking and problem solving. And one of Bruner's earliest insights back in the 1940s was that that's a false distinction, okay? Because the very process of perceiving requires you to think about the objects that you're perceiving. That all of perception is not made of the sensory stuff. It's not made of just what's in the stimulus, but when you perceive an object, you bring knowledge acquired through prior experience to bear on the act of perception. So what we want to do for the next couple of days is to talk about the categories that form the framework for social perception, and for that matter, for social memory. In my lectures on social memory, I focused on episodic memory. This is a moment where we can turn our attention to social semantic memory, because our categorical knowledge is something that's a feature or something that's a part of semantic memory. Semantic memory, you'll remember, is abstract, it's context-free, it's kind of like the mental dictionary or the mental encyclopedia. It doesn't hold your knowledge of specific events and experiences that have a unique location in time and place, but rather it's somewhat more abstract than that. Semantic memory holds our knowledge about objects in general, our knowledge about language, and it holds our categorical knowledge about subset and superset relationships, similarity relationships, relationships between categories and attributes, and so on. Okay? Now, in the social domain, what's important to understand is that categorization is an important cognitive basis for social behavior, for the simple reason that if we identify two people as belonging to the same category, or we identify two situations as belonging to the same category, we're likely to behave in the same way with respect to those two people or in those two situations. So categories constitute equivalence classes. They are, the members of a category are more or less equivalent with respect to category membership, and they elicit from us more or less equivalent forms of behavior. So that if you want to know how somebody's going to behave in some situation, you want to know how he or she is going to categorize that situation. We can expect people to behave relatively consistently across different situations that belong to the same category, but once we cross the categorical boundary, we can expect people to behave differently, that is, inconsistently. So categorization is the basis of perceptual similarity, but it's also the basis for behavioral similarity. A couple more things here. Let's just do a little bit of cognitive psychological background for a second. There's sometimes a difficult distinction between a category and a concept. For my purposes, we're going to use these terms interchangeably, but there is a technical distinction between them, which is, in some sense, the categories are, in some sense, objective. They exist in the real world outside the mind, and we can think about a concept as a mental representation of a category. That is, it's our image of what a category is like. So in the animal kingdom, there are birds and there are fish and there are mammals and there are protozoas, and those things exist in the real world, and they're related to each other by a set of real-world category relationships. Fish are cold-blooded vertebrates with fins and scales. Birds are warm-blooded vertebrates with feathers and wings. All fish have those objects, have those features. That's a category that's in the real world. But it turns out that when we represent our knowledge about categories, we sometimes don't use those kinds of features. And in fact, we often go beyond those defining features to represent categories in a way that's quite different than the way they exist in the real world. So the question for us for the next couple of days is first, there's a further distinction between two kinds of categories: natural categories, which are part of the natural world, okay, and artificial categories, which tend to be contrived by people mostly for the purposes of studying categorization, right? So the first thing that we want to know is, what's the relationship between the actual structure of the social world and the structure of the social world that we represent in our heads? Do we discover the categories that exist in the social world, or do we somehow impose that category structure because we bring to our experience of the world, our perception of the world, a set of more or less pre-existing categories? And then the second question you might want to ask is just how natural are social categories? As you'll see in a couple of minutes, some social categories look like they really are natural. They really do exist in the external, in the real world outside the mind, but others, not so much. They don't have all that kind of quality. Okay. Now, another point that I want to come back to in the third of these lectures is that cognitive psychology and cognitive science have developed a set of models of conceptual structure over the years. Those of you who have had Psych 1, especially if you've had it with me, know about this. Those of you who have had Cog Sci 1 also will know about this. That should be almost everybody in the class. But there are these views about how concepts and categories are structured. See, there I go. I'm already using these terms interchangeably. But the prevailing view in social cognition favors what's known as the prototype view, which is that categories are fuzzy sets. There aren't sharp boundaries between the categories. And rather than being summarized by a set of defining features that are characteristic of every single category member, like fish are cold-blooded vertebrates with scales and fins, what we have is what we mentally represent these categories in terms of a summary that focuses on characteristic features, not necessarily the kinds of defining features that are characteristic of proper sets. There are other kinds of views too, an exemplar view and a theory-based view, and you probably know all about that already. I'll come back to it in the third lecture where it's really critical. But first, let's start talking about what social categories we have and what they look like. Let's look not at the process of categorization so much, or the structure of categories in the abstract so much, but what categories we have and what their content looks like. In social psychology and social cognition, the first big category can be easily characterized as us versus them, okay? We naturally divide ourselves into groups, and as far as social cognition is concerned, we naturally divide the world into people who are like us and people who are not like us. This is an old insight. It comes from a sociologist named Summer, who who distinguished between what he called the we group, people like us, the group to which we belong, and others groups, which are everybody who's outside that group. And the next question, of course, is, well, who's we? Yeah. Well, it turns out that who we is depends a lot on how we perceive the groups that we're part of and what groups happen to be present at the time. But what Sumner's basic insight was, we'll always perceive ourselves as part of some group or other, and we perceive at least some other people as not in that group. That's a fundamental social distinction. In social psychology, the fundamental distinction between us and them is vividly illustrated by a classic experiment known as the Robbers Cave experiment, because it took place at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. This is work by Muzaffer Sharif and his colleagues, who surveyed Oklahoma City to find a group of fifth graders who were absolutely average in every conceivable respect. They were average in IQ, they were average in socioeconomic status, they were average in athletic ability, they were average in every dimension you can imagine a fifth grader can be measured on. And they found 22 of these kids, okay, and recruited them to participate in a summer camp experience that went on for about 20 days. And what happened was, these 22 kids were divided into two groups of 11, unbeknownst to them, and they were taken to separate campsites in Robbers Cave State Park, and encouraged to bond with each other by going through all sorts of various kinds of activities together, playing games and sharing wigwams or whatever it was that they slept in the park, and all of that business. And they were encouraged to kind of develop a group identity. One group began to call itself the Eagles, and the other group came to call itself the Rattlers, the Rattlesnakes. And for the first week or so of the experiment, they developed, each of these groups developed a tremendous amount of cohesion and harmony, and even a little hierarchical structure where there were leaders and followers, each group completely ignorant of the other, okay? In the second stage of the experiment, the two groups were brought together. They were saying, hey, you know, it turns out there's this other group of kids over on the other side of the park, and we're going to get together and we're going to have some contests and things like that. And what happened, of course, was that the Eagles and the Rattlers, instead of seeing themselves as perfectly average Oklahoma City kids who just happened to be in two groups, they developed a tremendous amount of intergroup hostility and the competitiveness and all of that business. Moreover, it turns out that as soon as the two groups were brought together, each group, the dynamics of each group changed so that there were changing patterns of leadership. So now, as soon as the two groups were engaged in athletic contests, the better athletes, remember these kids were all average to begin with, but still some kids are better at baseball than others, became leaders. Or when they were engaged in more intellectual pursuits, the smarter kids, kids who were perceived as smarter, became perceived as leaders. So everything changed when the two groups came together, but basically the two groups began to perceive themselves as us and the other group as them. This actually had, here's an example of the signs that the Rattlers came up with. They're scribbling this stuff on bed sheets and everything. At one point, there was a contest in which Sharif and his colleagues scattered a whole bunch of beans on a playing field, and there was a contest between the Eagles and the Rattlers in terms of who could pick up the most beans over a specified period of time. This was a long time ago. You could actually engage fifth graders in a contest like this without having them call you all sorts of names. And then what happened was the judges said, well, we're going to count these beans and we're going to find out who got the most. But The first, they flashed photographs, slides of the arrays of beans that each group had collected, and asked the kids to estimate how many beans were in each group. And the obvious result is that when the Eagles were the judges, the Eagles thought that they had picked up more beans than the Rattlers had. And when the Rattlers were the judges, the Rattlers thought that they had picked up more beans than the Eagles had. In fact, there were exactly the same number of beans in the array that they were viewing. The point here is that group membership even affected something as elementary as perception. Now, just so you know that things turned out okay, in the end, in stage 3, the two groups that had developed this tremendous rivalry were engaged in, were kind of led to engage in cooperative behavior. The Sharif and his colleagues staged a number of emergencies that required the two groups to compete with each other, and it turns out that these staged crises led the kids to cooperate. All of a sudden, they saw themselves as part of a larger whole, okay, which is kind of interesting. But the important thing is that these were just ordinary kids that were as identical to each other as you could possibly make kids in every way, but they still perceived themselves in this us and them fashion. An even more dramatic example of this comes from work by Henri Tajfel and his colleagues, known as the minimal group paradigm. Here, in the Sharif experiment, at least the kids had some basis for perceiving a we and a them. Actually, they had a week of group cohesion producing activities. But in these Tajfel experiments, people were essentially arbitrarily assigned to membership of in a group. In one case, on the basis of their purported artistic preferences. The subjects were given a test in which they were asked to choose which they preferred, paintings by Klee or paintings by Kandinsky, okay? And then they were told, oh, you're one of these people who prefers Klee's to Kandinsky's, and other people were told, oh, you're one of the people who prefers Kandinsky's to Klee's. In another version of the experiment, people were simply assigned to one group or another, group X or group Y, by virtue of a coin toss. Okay, so it's completely arbitrary. The individuals were told what their group membership was, but they never encountered any other members of their group or the other group. So they didn't know the others in either group. They had no basis for developing any kind of in-group or out-group stereotypes. There was, as opposed to the Robbers Cave experiment, there was absolutely no history of group interaction. Yet at one point, the investigators, Tajfel and his colleagues, asked group members, individuals, to distribute rewards between their group and the other group, between members of X and member of Y, just on the basis of these points. So you're given an allotment of points, and so how many points do you want to keep for your group, and how many points do you want to give to the other guys? And what happened was that people distributed more points to their own group than they did to the other group. And this is just two separate experiments showing this basic effect. Again, this is called the minimal group paradigm because these people didn't even know each other. They had absolutely no contact. Yet, because they were Klee preferring people or Kandinsky preferring people or heads versus tails people, they tended to prefer their own group to the others. On the basis of this, Henri Tajfel and his colleagues developed what they called a social identity theory, which basically says that once you become a member of a group, that's your in-group, and you increase the status of the in-group, you diminish the status of any out-group. Moreover, any achievement that is made by any member of the in-group tends to filter out to other members of the in-group so that they bask in reflected glory. When the Cal basketball team wins, this study's been done, people are more likely to wear California t-shirts and sweatshirts the next day because somehow that achievement filters down to the rest of the student body. So again, there's this social identity, the process that's going on. Moreover, it turns out that there is an interesting perceptual consequence of group membership, which is that people tend to perceive members of an in-group as more similar to each other and members of an out-group as less similar to them. So here is some work by Vernon Allen, who's one of my colleagues at Wisconsin, very nice study. Actually assigned people to groups based on their ratings of paintings by Paul Klee and Vasily Kandinsky. Actually, the assignment was random, but that's not what the subjects were told. Remember, the defining feature of a social psychologist is that he lies to his subjects. Okay, that's how you know a social psychologist as opposed to any other kind of psychologist. And then these individuals were asked to simply to predict, to respond to a bunch of attitude questions, and then to predict the responses of other members of their group and the other group. And what Allen and Wilder, David Wilder, found was what's now known as the outgroup homogeneity effect, which is that people tend to perceive members of an outgroup as more similar to each other and perceive members of an in-group as more similar to themselves. Here's an example of this. Difference from the self. These, again, we have two experiments. People perceive the in-group as more similar to themselves and out-group members as more dissimilar to themselves. So again, just simple group membership, even very arbitrary group membership, will have these effects both on non-social perception, like estimating the number of beans spilled out of a bag, and on social perception, estimating the attitudes and other social characteristics of various group members. Okay, now mostly we are not randomly assigned to groups by virtue of a coin toss. Mostly we're not assigned to groups by virtue of our preference for paintings by Paul Klee or Vasily Kandinsky, but there are natural social groupings that we are part of, and those are the basic categories for social categorization. Next question is, what are these? Roger Brown, famous social psychologist, thought about this problem quite a bit, and he argued that when it comes to the social domain, especially when it comes to persons, that there are certain categories that seem to him to be very natural categories. That is, the social world naturally divided itself up in various ways, like in terms of sex or kinship or age, or again, you can get into more interesting social categories. It's an interesting idea. I think Brown was really onto something here. But one of the interesting things about this is that as natural as many of these categories appear, it turns out, in the first place, many of these categories are very hard to define. Second, different groups, different cultures will define these categories differently, okay? And third, that the categories themselves will change over time. Let's look at what must be, by any standard, the most natural, the most fundamental, the most biologically given of all social categorizations, which is sex or gender, okay? It just naturally seems to be the case that we divide the world into thems that male, thems that are female, and each of us is one or the other. That creates a kind of natural, biologically determined out-group and in-group. So your category membership is determined by your chromosomal sex and by your phenotypic sex and all of that. And what you've got here is a very interesting kind of intersection of categories, because, you know, here you've got natural categories determined by chromosomal sex and phenotypic sex, but there's also a kind of artificial division to them too. For most of us, most of our social interactions don't depend so much on what sex we are. I mean, sharing notes and stuff like that. It doesn't happen. Friday nights, Saturday nights, maybe something interesting happens, right? And there's also a kind of intersection of the biological and social here. But it turns out that even something as apparently simple as classifying people in terms of sex or gender turns out to be kind of complicated, okay? And Fausto Sterling, a biologist at Brown University, for example, has argued that, in fact, we've got roughly 5 different the categories of biological sex. There's the traditional male and female, and there are, in her view anyway, 3 categories of what she calls intersex or pseudo-hermaphrodites. There are individuals out there who are genetically male, have an XY chromosomal heritage, but for a variety of reasons have female reproductive anatomy. And there are individuals who are genetically female, but who have, with at least in some respects, male reproductive anatomy. And then there's apparently 2 people on Earth who actually have undifferentiated gonadal tissue, where the gonads are, in some sense, half ovaries and half testes. But Fausto Sterling's the point here is that the division of the world into male and female isn't quite as neat and clean as you'd like it to be. And it turns out it's even trickier than that, because superimposed on biological sex, which is what Fausto Sterling is talking about, we have an issue of gender identity, which is whether you identify yourself as male or as female or as transgendered, okay? Transgendered individuals are biologically male but identify themselves as female, biologically female but identify themselves as male. So if you want to classify people with respect to sex and gender, you have to think about not just their chromosomal sex or their external and internal reproductive anatomy, but you have to think about how they think about themselves, how they identify themselves. And then it turns out that there's a whole host of gender categories that go beyond identity. Every culture that's been studied makes role distinctions between males and females. Every culture that's been studied has some kind of concept of masculinity that's different from the concept of femininity. Some people see themselves adopt a masculine gender role, even though they may identify themselves as female. Some people adopt a feminine gender role, even though they may identify themselves as male. Then there are people who embrace both masculine and feminine characteristics. In this culture, they're sometimes called androgynous individuals. And then there are people who just don't really embrace either masculinity or femininity as those terms are defined within their culture. So we got 4 different types of gender role. And the point here is that whether you're male or not biologically is not decisive for how you identify yourself. And whether you identify yourself as male or female is not decisive for the role that you play in your society. And then finally, you've got the differences with respect to sexual orientation. Yes, the typical male is probably sexually oriented more towards females than towards males. That's how we usually carve up the world. But there are men and women who have a homosexual sexual orientation. There are some who are bisexual, and then there are people who are just asexual, don't seem to have any kind of sexual orientation at all. So here, what started out as a apparently straightforward division of the world into 2 kinds, male and female, you end up with 240 kinds, okay? You got 5 different biological sexes, if we just kind of follow Fausto Sterling's argument for a second. You got 3 gender identities, you got 4 gender roles, and you got 4 sexual orientations. What used to be a simple division of the world into us and them, males and females, okay, turns out to be a whole lot more complicated than that, right? Okay? But from a social point of view, from a social psychological point of view, you got 240 categories of people, okay, that you got to pay attention to, and that's just for starters. That's just with respect to issues of gender and sex. Let's look at another one, the second of Brown's natural social categories, which are kinship categories, okay? And here again, things look kind of simple. You've got the nuclear family consisting of a mother and a father. Okay, everybody's got one, even if they're not alive or not in the environment or whatever. And then there are sons and daughters, and if there's more than one child in a family, there are brothers and sisters. These are natural categories that are determined in biological terms by blood relationships, okay? And then you've got your extended family, great-grandparents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and stuff like that. And these categories are very clear. What's a grandfather? What are the defining features of a grandfather? Your parent's father. Okay, you got two of them. Okay, you got a maternal grandfather and you got a aunts. What's an aunt? That's right. Okay, so it's all very clear, right? Well, it turns out it's not all that clear because, again, the anthropologists who have studied this find that different cultures perceive kinship quite differently. If you look at the linguistic labels that they have for the various kinship categories, there are various cultures that go way beyond brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and so on. This is just a selection, okay, of the vast variety of kinship categories, just sibling categories that have been found by anthropologists. In type A societies, the type A cultures, for example, they only have one word for sibling, and they don't distinguish between male siblings and female siblings. There's no word in these languages for like our distinction between brother and sister. Type B, that's English-speaking culture, makes a linguistic distinction between brothers and sisters. Type C cultures make a distinction between elder and younger brothers, but don't make a similar distinction between elder and younger sisters. There are sisters, there are elder brothers, and there are younger brothers. So you got three categories of brothers that are differentiated with respect to age. Type H, the categories distinguish between elder and younger sisters as well as elder and younger brothers. Type G categories make a distinction between parallel sibships and cross-sex sibships. So they have a word for the brother of a brother, for the brother of a male, that's different from the word for the brother of a female. Okay? That's the way that culture divides up kinship. It's very different from the way we do it, but that's the way they do it. And then there are these type L the cultures that have actually four sibship categories where they make a distinction between parallel versus cross and elder versus younger brothers and sisters. So 2 times 2 times 2 is 8 different sibship categories that are prominent in that culture. So how you're going to divide the world with respect to something as simple as who's your brother or how are you related to this other person that you sit at the breakfast table with, right, is going to be determined by the particular culture that you're in. Here is a very nice example of sibling terminology in Hopi the culture, for that matter Hopi language, makes a distinction between your elder brother, okay, and your elder sister, makes a distinction between the younger sister of a male and the younger brother of a male, but there's no distinction between the younger brother of a male and the younger sibling of a female. So it's a very complicated kinship system. And the point is, if you're Hopi, you have to carry this around in your head. because that's the way you organize kinship if you're a Hopi. And if you go move into another culture, you have to learn an entirely different set of kinship categories. So again, you'd think that kinship categories would be pretty natural. Are you a first-degree relative or a second-degree relative or a third-degree relative or whatever, okay? And it turns out it can be a lot more complicated than that, but it's because the culture imposes distinctions on people that are not necessarily there naturally. Or perhaps put another way, cultures push categories together that don't necessarily have to be put together. Okay, here's another example. Age. This is the third of Roger Brown's natural categories. Okay, we make a distinction between older people and younger people. But again, if you think about this for a second, age categories turn out to be pretty complicated. Okay, so for example, it's easy to make a distinction between prenatal and postnatal, okay, when you're in the womb versus when you're not in the womb. But it turns out that there are debates that are essentially debates about social categorization that have to do with finer distinctions than that. So, for example, the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade and other abortion-related decisions makes a distinction between the first 2 trimesters of pregnancy and the third trimester of pregnancy. Abortions are legal in the first 2 trimesters, but they're not typically allowed in the third trimester. In biologists, we'll make a distinction between, in embryological terms, between a zygote, that one fusion of egg and sperm, the blastocyst, and the embryo as the zygote begins to divide. But again, if you think about the abortion debate for a second, there are people who argue that you're human from the moment of conception. They don't make a distinction between these various categories of prenatal existence. Get out of the womb, and we have a distinction between infancy and childhood, between adolescence and young adulthood, between adulthood and being elderly. And there are all sorts of other categories that are very useful for people who have to deal with kids in these categories. For example, you can't just talk about children being in the childhood stage, right? Because you have to make a distinction between toddlers and kids who are in the terrible 2 stage. My favorite is kids who are in the white food stage, where all they'll eat is macaroni and cheese and white bread and things like that. We now make a distinction between preteens. You're not a child, and then you become a teenager anymore like you used to, okay? Now you go through this preteen stage, which is a culturally contrived category. Tweens, okay? Kids who are 11 and 12, not a teenager yet, but they're kind of being defined in terms of that category. Now that there's a lot of aging research, cognitive psychologists make a distinction between those who are merely elderly, right, and what they call the old, right? That's a socially imposed category, right? A category that's all based on a continuum of how many cells have divided, a continuum of how long it's been since conception, a continuum of how long it's been since. These are all continuous quantities, right? But we divide them up in various ways. Now, these are more or less biological distinctions in age, but it turns out that there are lots of other kind of psychological distinctions. Those of you who have had a course in personality, some social psychology courses, know that the neo-Freudian psychoanalyst Erik Erikson made himself famous by distinguishing between what he called the 8 ages of man, a phrase that's derived from Shakespeare, and made a distinction between early childhood and adolescence and young adulthood and middle adulthood, kind of gave age spans for these, but more important, characterized them psychologically in terms of the crisis that occurs at each of these ages and the virtues that develop as the person resolves the crisis. So for Erickson, what defines the 8 ages of man are not how old you are, not exactly, but what you're doing, what your tasks are in your life, what kinds of challenges you're facing. And this is very big now. When you get to be older than about 25, you begin to think about and read about these things. The midlife crisis. Okay, now there's a stage. Oh, he's just going through a midlife crisis. Well, you got to be at a particular age to go through a midlife crisis. So Roger Gould has argued that there are these periods of transformation that people tend to go through. This is just another way of categorizing people with respect to age. There are lots of popular press treatments of this. Here's Gail Shees, okay? 18 to 22, you're pulling up roots, you're moving out of your parents' house, if you hadn't been kicked out already. Age 22 to 28, she calls the trying 20s. 35 to 45, the deadline decade. You gotta get married, you gotta have a kid, you gotta buy a house, you gotta get tenure, you gotta do all these things on somebody's deadline. Gail, she's got a new book now, relatively new book, in which you gotta have a kind of particular flair for language here. The tryout 20s, right? She argues that people in their 20s are engaged in kind of trying out different kinds of identities. The turbulent 30s, the flaming 50s. I missed that somehow, and I'm looking forward to the serene 60s in any event. But just again, get a flavor for how various pieces of a continuum are being divided up, and they're being divided up basically in terms of social tasks, social attributes. Okay. Here's Roger Levinson's, again, same kind of thing. Here's one that came up in the presidential election. There are social categories of people depending on essentially when they were born, not how old they are, but essentially when they were born. And historians, especially American historians, refer to people who were born in 1860 to 1882 as the missionary generation, sent a lot of people to China and Hawaii and places like that. The lost generation, Ernest Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald. The silent generation, people who came of age in around World War II. The baby boomers, people who were produced by the silent generation, okay? Then there's people who are closer to you in your own age, Generation X or Generation Y kinds of individuals. These are social categories, okay? They are socially determined categories, and people who fall within these categories are perceived as somehow similar to each other and different from members of other social categories. Just to make it clear, these generational boundaries are in fact quite fuzzy, and there are different scholars and different institutions will define these things a little bit differently. The Census Bureau defines baby boomers in terms of people who were born in 1946 after World War II ended, but two sociologists, Howe and Strauss, have argued that you really should start defining the baby boom beginning with people born in 1943, which is when the first troops started coming home from their service in World War II. Again, there are different definitions of Generation X as well. Point is, it's not exactly arbitrary, these categories, but they are fuzzy boundaries, but they can create the basis for very interesting generational conflicts, which we saw in the presidential election, which pitted John McCain, okay, a member of the silent generation, okay, against Hillary Rodham Clinton, a member of the baby boom generation, against Barack Obama, who is a member of the baby bust generation. Barack Obama is not a baby boomer in terms of usual kinds of things. And what was interesting is the way the presidential campaign turned out. Usually there are some presidential campaigns that pit members of adjacent generations against each other. You can think about, say, John F. Kennedy replacing Dwight Eisenhower as president of the United States. But here, in the contest between Barack Obama and John McCain, you actually had two opponents who were separated by an entire generation in terms of these social categories. And it was quite clear that while McCain and Hillary Rodham Clinton had some way of meeting each other, right? And these two coming from adjacent generations, but Obama and McCain, they just never connected at all as candidates, right? And one of the reasons for that, ostensibly, is that they're really members of generations that are just too separate from each other. Okay, here's another example, just to get away from American culture for a second. You can look at generational labels in what's known as the Japanese diaspora, that is, Japanese who live outside the home islands. And there's a very common distinction between Issei's, who emigrated from Japan before 1924, Niseis, who were the American-born children of Issei's, Sanseis, who were the baby boom children of Niseis, and Yanseis, who are basically the Generation X or Generation Y children of Sanseis. This is a distinction that doesn't make much sense to anybody who's not Japanese. But to somebody who's Japanese, you'll find, especially if you get a group of Japanese Americans who are of widely dispersed ages, they will identify themselves and perceive themselves as similar to members of these particular kinds of categories. Okay, just do one or two more, and then next time we're going to look at ethnic and racial and national kinds of things. But just again to point out what these kinds of categories look like. In psychology, we have intellectual categories that are basically based on IQ or on the presumed IQ, people of normal IQ and people who are geniuses, okay? And then we have people who are, I put this in quotes, this is the old term, mental defective, for people who had very low IQs, but it wasn't enough just to label somebody as mentally defective. Some scholars had to make further distinctions based on just how mentally defective you were or presumed to be. These are essentially technical terms in psychology and psychiatry that were imported into natural language. We have a typology of intellectual types. If somebody asks you, what's your roommate like? You say, oh, he's an idiot. You know? Well, okay. So that's a classification of people, right? And that provides some information as to what some people are like. But it's a term that we use more or less independently of its technical definition. Just like the biological categories exist more or less independently of their technical definition. Just like age categories exist. If you want to know what age somebody is, just say he's 61 or she's 24 or whatever. But no, we don't do that. We say, oh, he's a classic baby boomer or he's one of the silent generation. Provides much more information about what that person is really like. Social categories are in some sense natural categories, but in very real senses, they diverge from what would seem to be the natural way of dividing up the social universe. A point we'll pick up next time when we talk about race, ethnicity, and nationality. Thank you very much. We'll see you on Wednesday.